My son kicked me out of the house after I refused to transfer all my assets to his name. 2 days later, his wife brought me a slice of cake and said, "I made it just for you, to smooth things over." The texture felt strange, so I switched it with her plate instead. 30 minutes later, everything I thought I knew about my family would change forever. The real story started 3 weeks earlier on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was in my garden, tending to the roses Richard had planted for our 30th anniversary, when David's expensive SUV pulled into the driveway. He never visited on weekdays anymore, not since Sandra had convinced him that successful men don't have time for social calls with their mothers. "Mom, we need to talk."
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
His voice carried that businesslike tone he'd developed since marrying Sandra 5 years ago. Gone was the warmth, the easy affection we'd shared when he was growing up. In its place was this cold efficiency that made me feel like a client in his insurance office, rather than the woman who'd raised him alone after his father died. I followed him into the house I'd called home for 35 years. The house where I'd nursed him through childhood illnesses, celebrated his graduation, and mourned my husband. David pulled out a folder thick with legal documents. "Sandra and I have been talking about your financial situation, about your future. We think it would be best if you transferred your assets to my name, for tax purposes, and we'd like to put the house in my name too, so you don't have to worry about maintenance and property taxes." My financial situation was perfectly fine, thank you very much. Richard's life insurance had paid off the mortgage years ago. My pension from teaching covered my modest needs, and I'd even managed to save nearly $300,000 over the years. "David, I'm 67, not 97. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw Sandra's influence written clearly across his face. "Mom, be reasonable. You're not getting any younger. What if something happens to you? What if you get sick and can't make decisions? And where would I live while you're taking care of everything? Here, of course. This would still be your home. We'd just handle the paperwork side of things." But I knew Sandra. I'd watched her redecorate David's bachelor apartment the week after their engagement, erasing every trace of his previous life with ruthless efficiency. I'd seen how she'd slowly isolated him from his college friends, his work colleagues, even his favorite hobbies. The woman who'd convinced my son that his mother's homemade Christmas cookies were too heavy and not sophisticated enough for their holiday parties would not let me remain the lady of this house for long. "I need time to think about it," I said. David's expression darkened. "There's nothing to think about, Mom. Sandra's already spoken to her lawyer friend. He says these kinds of transfers are standard for people your age." "My age," I repeated softly. "Look, we're trying to help you here. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The phrase echoed strangely in my mind. How many times had I heard those exact words over the past 5 years? When Sandra had convinced David to skip our traditional Christmas Eve dinner, when they'd canceled our weekly Sunday dinners because Sandra needed David for her various projects, when Sandra had suggested I might be more comfortable at the senior center rather than joining them for David's birthday celebration. I said, "No, David, I'm not signing anything." His face flushed red, and suddenly I was looking at a stranger wearing my son's features. "Fine, then you'll need to find somewhere else to live." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Excuse me? If you're not going to be reasonable about this, then maybe it's time you found an apartment. Something more suitable for someone your age. Sandra's been looking at some nice senior communities." I stared at him. This man I'd carried for 9 months, delivered after 18 hours of labor, raised through scraped knees and broken hearts and teenage rebellion. "You're throwing me out of my own home?" "It's not throwing you out. It's helping you transition to the next phase of your life." The clinical language, the cold efficiency of it all, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't David's idea. This was Sandra's solution to the Margaret problem, and my son had become her willing accomplice. "I see," I said quietly. And when do you need me gone?" "We'd prefer if you could pack your things by the weekend. Sandra's already found you a temporary place to stay." Temporary. As if my life, my home, my independence were just inconveniences to be managed around Sandra's greater plans. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 67 years settle into my bones. I'll call my sister Helen. I'm sure she'll let me stay with her while I figure things out. David's relief was visible, which somehow hurt worse than his anger. That's great, Mom. I knew you'd understand, but I didn't understand. I didn't understand how the boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers had grown into a man who could discard his mother like outdated furniture. I didn't understand how 5 years of marriage had erased 30 years of love and loyalty. What I did understand was that I was about to learn exactly what kind of people my son and his wife really were. 3 days later, I was sitting in Helen's cramped kitchen, surrounded by hastily packed suitcases, when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Sandra's silver BMW parked in the driveway, gleaming like a weapon in the afternoon sun. "Margaret," Sandra's voice rang out as Helen opened the door. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I brought you something special." She swept into the kitchen carrying a covered cake plate, her smile bright enough to power the neighborhood. Everything about her was perfect as always. Her blonde hair styled in expensive waves, her makeup flawless, her designer dress probably worth more than most people's monthly salary. "I made this just for you," she said, setting the plate on Helen's kitchen table with a theatrical flourish, "to smooth things over between us. I know the transition has been difficult, but I want you to know there are no hard feelings." No hard feelings. As if she were the one who'd been forced from her home by an ungrateful family member. Helen excused herself to answer a phone call, leaving Sandra and me alone with whatever peace offering she'd brought. Sandra lifted the cover to reveal a beautiful chocolate cake, perfectly frosted and decorated with delicate roses made of icing. "It's German chocolate," Sandra said, cutting 2 generous slices. "David mentioned it was your favorite." It was my favorite, though I was surprised David remembered. Sandra placed a plate in front of me and sat down with her own slice, fork poised expectantly. "Go ahead," she urged when I didn't immediately pick up my fork. "I've been experimenting with the recipe. I'm curious what you think." Something in her tone made me hesitate. There was an eagerness there, an intensity that seemed disproportionate to cake tasting. I picked up my fork and cut a small piece, bringing it close to my nose. The smell was right. Rich chocolate, coconut, pecans. But there was something else underneath. Something that didn't belong. The texture looked slightly off too, grainier than it should be, with tiny specks that could have been extra nuts or could have been something else entirely. "Is everything all right?" Sandra asked, her own fork still untouched. "I'm just savoring the moment," I said, setting my fork down and reaching for my coffee cup. "You know, at my age, you learn to appreciate the thoughtful gestures." As I lifted my coffee, I deliberately knocked over the cream pitcher, sending a small flood across the table toward our plates. "Oh, goodness, I'm so clumsy," I said, jumping up to grab paper towels. In the chaos of cleaning up, I switched our plates while Sandra rushed to save her purse from the spreading puddle. When we sat back down, Sandra picked up what had been my fork and took a large bite of what had been my slice of cake. She said, though her smile seemed forced. "It's perfect, don't you think?" I took a small bite of what had been her slice and nearly gagged. The taste was wrong, bitter, metallic, with an undertone that made my throat want to close up immediately. "It's very unique," I managed, setting my fork down permanently. Sandra, meanwhile, was working her way steadily through her slice, occasionally glancing at my barely touched plate with what looked like growing concern. 20 minutes later, as Sandra was preparing to leave, she suddenly gripped the edge of the table. "I feel a bit dizzy," she said, her perfectly made-up face now pale and clammy. "Maybe you should sit down," I suggested, though my heart was pounding with the terrible knowledge of what I'd just witnessed. "No, I need to get home to David," she said, but as she stood, her legs gave out completely. The ambulance arrived just as Sandra lost consciousness on Helen's kitchen floor. As the paramedics worked over her, I caught sight of her purse, which had fallen open during her collapse. There, nestled between her wallet and lipstick, was a small container of rat poison, the label clearly visible. The emergency room was a blur of fluorescent lights and urgent voices. I sat in the waiting area, my hands folded in my lap, watching doctors and nurses rush past. Helen paced beside me, her face pale with shock. "I can't believe this is happening," she whispered. "In my kitchen, on my table." I couldn't speak. The image of that rat poison container kept flashing in my mind. How long had Sandra been planning this? How long had she been carrying death in her designer purse, waiting for the right moment? A doctor in green scrubs approached us. "Are you family of Sandra Morrison?" "I'm her mother-in-law," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "She's stable now, but it was close. We've pumped her stomach and she's responding to treatment. The blood work shows she ingested a significant amount of brodifacoum. That's a common rat poison." Helen gasped. "Rat poison? But how?" The doctor looked puzzled. "That's what we're trying to understand. Do you know if she had any reason to be around rodenticides? Any pest control work at home recently?" I shook my head. "Not that I know of." "Well, we've contacted the police as required for any suspected poisoning case. They'll want to speak with both of you since it happened at your residence." After the doctor left, Helen turned to me with wide eyes. "Margaret, what really happened in that kitchen?" I told her everything. About the strange texture of the cake, the metallic taste, the way Sandra had watched me so intently. About switching the plates during the spill. Helen listened in growing horror. "You think she was trying to poison you?" "I know she was trying to poison me. But why? Just because you wouldn't sign over your assets?" I thought about Sandra's spending habits, the designer clothes, the luxury car, the expensive renovations she'd been pressuring David to make on the house that would be theirs once I was out of the picture permanently. $300,000 is a lot of money to someone like Sandra, I said quietly. "And a 67-year-old woman dying quietly in her sleep after a family dispute? Who would question that too closely?" Helen's face went white. "We have to tell the police." "Tell them what? That I think my daughter-in-law tried to poison me but accidentally poisoned herself instead? They'll think I'm a paranoid old woman. But the rat poison in her purse could be explained away. Maybe she bought it for David's house? Maybe she was dealing with a rodent problem. Without proof that she put it in the cake, it's just my word against hers." My phone buzzed. David's name flashed on the screen. "Mom? I'm at the hospital. They said Sandra collapsed at Helen's house. What happened?" I could hear the panic in his voice, the genuine concern for his wife. Even after everything she'd done, everything she'd tried to do, he still loved her, still trusted her completely. "She brought me a cake to apologize for the misunderstanding," I said carefully. "She became ill shortly after eating it." "A cake? What kind of cake?" "German chocolate. She said you told her it was my favorite." There was a pause. "I never told her that. I mean, I know you like it, but I never specifically—" "Mom, I'm coming to get you. You shouldn't be alone right now." 20 minutes later, David arrived, his face haggard with worry. He hugged me tightly, and for a moment, he felt like my son again instead of Sandra's husband. "The doctors say she's going to be okay," he said, "but they found rat poison in her system. They think someone might have tried to hurt her." "Who would want to hurt Sandra?" I asked, watching his face carefully. His expression darkened. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Maybe it was meant for both of you. Maybe someone has a grudge against our family." The protective instinct in his voice broke my heart. He was ready to fight the world to protect the woman who had just tried to murder his mother. "David," I said gently, "has Sandra seemed worried about anything lately? Money troubles? Problems with anyone? Money troubles? No, why would you ask that? Business has been good and Sandra's been talking about redecorating the house. She's been researching contractors, getting estimates. Redecorating with my money, I thought bitterly. Planning to spend my savings on a house I'd never lived to see completed. Has she seemed anxious? Stressed? David frowned. "Well, she has been a little on edge lately. She's been talking about how we need to plan for the future, make sure we're financially secure. She worries about what would happen if something happened to me or—" He trailed off. "Or what? Or if something happened to you. She's been saying we need to make sure all the legal paperwork is in order, for inheritance purposes. She doesn't want there to be any complications if I die." "Mom, don't say it like that. She's just being practical." "Practical." Sandra had been planning my death and calling it practical. Detective Ray Collins was a soft-spoken man in his 50s with kind eyes that missed nothing. He interviewed Helen and me separately, taking detailed notes about the afternoon's events. "So you switched the plates during the cleanup?" he asked. "It was an accident. I was flustered by the spill and just grabbed the nearest clean plate. And you noticed something unusual about the taste? It was bitter, metallic, not like any German chocolate cake I'd ever had. But you didn't suspect poison at that time." "Of course not. Who would suspect such a thing?" Detective Collins studied his notes. "The victim had a container of rat poison in her purse. Do you know why she might have been carrying that?" "I have no idea. Any idea why someone might want to harm either you or Mrs. Morrison?" I hesitated. This was the moment to tell him about the asset transfer demand, about Sandra's manipulation of David, about my suspicions. But looking at this kind man who was just trying to do his job, I realized how insane it would all sound. "We had a family disagreement recently," I said finally, "about my living arrangements. Sandra and David felt I should move to a senior community. I disagreed. And this disagreement was serious enough that someone might want to hurt you over it?" I don't know." Detective Collins closed his notebook. "We're treating this as a suspected poisoning. Mrs. Wilson, we'll be investigating thoroughly. In the meantime, I'd recommend being very careful about what you eat and drink, especially anything you don't prepare yourself." After he left, I sat alone in Helen's living room, staring at the spot where Sandra had collapsed. The police had taken the remaining cake as evidence, along with Sandra's purse and its damning contents. But I knew that Sandra was smart. She would have an explanation for the rat poison. She would paint herself as the victim and me as the paranoid old woman who was probably losing her mind with age. And David would believe her, because that's what love does. It makes you blind to the truth, even when the truth is trying to kill you. My phone rang again. This time it was Sandra herself, calling from her hospital bed. "Margaret," her voice was weak but determined. "I need to see you. There's something important I need to tell you about what happened today." Sandra looked fragile against the white hospital sheets, her usually perfect hair limp and her face pale without makeup. But her eyes were as calculating as ever when I walked into the room. "Margaret, thank you for coming," she said, her voice hoarse. "I've been thinking about what happened, and I'm terrified." I pulled a chair close to her bed, studying her face. "Terrified of what?" "Someone tried to kill me today. The doctors confirmed it was rat poison." She reached for my hand with trembling fingers. "What if they were really trying to kill you, and I just got in the way?" The performance was masterful. If I hadn't seen the poison container in her purse myself, I might have believed her. "Why would anyone want to kill me, Sandra?" "Your inheritance, Margaret. $300,000 and that beautiful house. Some people would do anything for that kind of money." She squeezed my hand tighter. "I'm so scared that whoever did this will try again." "Do you have any idea who might want to hurt me?" Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "I've been thinking about it all afternoon. What if it's someone close to us? Someone who knows about your assets, who knows our family routines?" The suggestion hung in the air between us. She was planting seeds of suspicion, trying to make me paranoid about everyone around me. Everyone except her, of course. "Sandra, the police found rat poison in your purse." For just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw a flash of panic before the innocent confusion returned. "What? That's impossible. I bought some last week for the house. We've been having problems with mice in the garage, but I never—" She looked genuinely bewildered. "Oh my God, Margaret, what if someone put it in my purse? What if they're trying to frame me? Who would do that?" "I don't know, but think about it. If something happened to you and the police found poison in my purse, who would they suspect? It's the perfect setup." I had to admire her quick thinking. Within hours of nearly dying from her own poison, she'd crafted a story that made her both victim and potential scapegoat. "Sandra, when you brought the cake today, you seemed very insistent that I eat it. Because I was proud of it. I'd spent all morning perfecting the recipe. I wanted to show you that I could do something nice, that I wasn't the evil daughter-in-law you think I am." "I don't think you're evil." Don't you? Her voice turned bitter. You've never liked me, Margaret. From the day David brought me home, you've been waiting for me to fail. There was truth in that, though not for the reasons she implied. I'd disliked her because I'd sensed her manipulative nature from the beginning, the way she worked to isolate David from everyone who might see through her act. I want what's best for David, I said simply. So do I. That's why I've been trying to convince you to think about your financial future. David worries about you constantly. He's afraid something will happen to you, and you'll be vulnerable because you're so independent about everything. David worries about me? All the time. He feels guilty about asking you to move out, but, Margaret, he's just trying to protect you. That house is too big for one person, and you're isolated there. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency? Who would find you? The concern in her voice sounded genuine, but I knew better. Every word was calculated to make me feel vulnerable, dependent, grateful for their intervention. I appreciate David's concern, I said, but I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Are you? Because someone just tried to poison you today, and if I hadn't accidentally eaten that cake instead of you, you'd be dead right now. The words sent a chill through me, not because of their content, but because of the satisfaction I glimpsed in her eyes as she said them. You saved my life, I said quietly. I would never let anything happen to you. Margaret, you're David's mother. Your family. She squeezed my hand again. That's why I think you should reconsider the asset transfer. Not because we want your money, but because it would protect you. If your assets were in David's name, no one would have a motive to hurt you. And there it was. The real reason for this hospital visit, for this carefully orchestrated performance. Sandra was using her own poisoning to convince me to sign over my assets. I need time to think about everything that's happened, I said, standing up. Of course. But Margaret, please be careful. Whoever did this might try again. And next time, I might not be there to protect you. I walked out of the hospital room with Sandra's words echoing in my mind. The most chilling part wasn't her threats or manipulation. It was how quickly she'd adapted her strategy, turning her failed murder attempt into another tool to get what she wanted. But Sandra had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me. At home that evening, I sat at Helen's kitchen table with my laptop, researching everything I could find about rat poison, the symptoms, the timing, the amount needed to kill an adult. What I learned made my blood run cold. The dose Sandra had ingested should have been fatal. The only reason she'd survived was because she'd vomited most of it up within 30 minutes of eating the cake, which meant the amount she'd put in my slice would have killed me quickly and efficiently. This wasn't a warning or a scare tactic. This was premeditated murder, planned down to the last detail. I thought about Detective Collins' advice to be careful about what I ate and drank. But the real danger wasn't from some unknown enemy. It was from the woman lying in that hospital bed, probably already planning her next attempt. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Just left Sandra at the hospital. She's worried about you. Maybe it's time to consider that senior community she found. Just temporarily, until the police catch whoever did this. I stared at the message, seeing Sandra's influence in every word. Even from her hospital bed, she was manipulating my son, using fear to push her agenda. But two could play at manipulation. If Sandra wanted to paint herself as my protector, I would let her. I would play the frightened, grateful mother-in-law who finally understood that she needed her family's help. And while she thought she was winning, I would be gathering evidence. Because Sandra had made one thing clear today: she wouldn't stop until I was dead, or she had complete control of my assets. I picked up my phone and typed back to David. You're right. Maybe it is time to consider my options. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss it? His response came immediately. Of course, Mom. Sandra will be so relieved. She's been so worried about you. I smiled grimly as I set the phone aside. Let Sandra think she was winning. Let her believe that fear had made me compliant. She had no idea that she'd just declared war on the wrong woman. I spent the next 3 days playing the part of a frightened, grateful mother-in-law. When David visited, I spoke nervously about feeling unsafe, about maybe needing protection. When Sandra called from the hospital, I thanked her repeatedly for saving my life. "I've been so foolish," I told her during one call. "You and David have been trying to help me, and I've been too stubborn to listen." "Oh, Margaret, I'm just glad you're safe," Sandra cooed. "David and I only want what's best for you." But while I played my role, I was also conducting my own investigation. I drove to the hardware store where Sandra claimed she'd bought the rat poison and spoke with the manager. The security cameras had captured her purchase, but what they showed made my stomach churn. Sandra hadn't bought just one container of rat poison. She'd bought 3, and she'd asked specific questions about how much would be needed to kill a large rat problem. "Yeah, I remember her," the store clerk said. "Pretty blonde lady, real nervous about rodents. She asked about mixing it with food to make sure the rats would eat it. Wanted to know how fast it would work. The timing was perfect, too. Sandra had made the purchase the day after I'd refused to sign the asset transfer papers. She'd gone straight from our confrontation to planning my murder. I also drove past my old house, the one Sandra and David now called home. Sandra's BMW was in the driveway, which meant she'd been released from the hospital. But there was another car there, too. A white sedan with Colorado plates that I didn't recognize. I parked down the street and watched. After an hour, a man in an expensive suit emerged from the house, carrying a briefcase. He looked like a lawyer, and he was clearly in a hurry. That evening, I called David. "How is Sandra feeling? I was thinking of bringing her some soup." "That's sweet, Mom, but she's still pretty weak. Maybe give her a few more days to recover." His voice sounded strained. "Actually, there's something I need to talk to you about. Can you come over tomorrow?" "Of course. Is everything all right?" "It's just some financial things. Sandra's lawyer thinks we should move quickly on the asset transfer, given what happened to you. For your protection." Sandra's lawyer, not David's lawyer or our family lawyer. Sandra's lawyer, the man in the expensive suit who'd been at my house. "I understand," I said. "I'll be there at 10. The next morning, I arrived at what had been my home for 35 years to find Sandra propped up on the living room couch like an invalid, surrounded by legal documents. The lawyer, introduced as Mr. Brennan, sat at my old dining room table with papers spread before him. "Mrs. Wilson," Mr. Brennan said, standing to shake my hand. "I'm so sorry to hear about the attempt on your life. Fortunately, we can protect you from any future incidents by ensuring your assets are properly secured." "How would that protect me?" I asked, taking a seat across from him. "Well, if someone is targeting you for financial gain, removing that motive eliminates the threat. Once your assets are transferred to your son, you'd no longer be a target." It was a neat theory, except for one glaring flaw. The person targeting me for financial gain was sitting on the couch, watching every word with calculating eyes. "I see the logic," I said slowly, "but I'm concerned about giving up all control of my finances." "Oh, you wouldn't be giving up control," Sandra interjected quickly. "You'd still live in the house, still have access to everything you need. It would just be safer." Mr. Brennan nodded. "Think of it as a protective measure. Your son would be the legal owner, but you'd have lifetime rights to the property and access to the funds for your care." "What kind of access?" "Whatever you need for living expenses, medical care, reasonable personal expenses." He slid a document across the table. "It's all outlined here." I read through the papers carefully. The language was dense, but the intent was clear. Once I signed, David would have complete control over my assets. Any money I wanted to spend would require his approval. And if something happened to David, control would pass to his wife. "This gives Sandra a lot of power over my finances," I observed. "Only in the event that something happens to David," Mr. Brennan said smoothly. "And Mrs. Morrison has assured me that your care and comfort would always be her top priority." I looked at Sandra, who gave me her most sincere smile. "Margaret, after what happened with the poisoning, I realize how precious you are to our family. I would never let anything happen to you." The audacity of it took my breath away. She was asking me to trust her with my life savings while sitting there knowing she'd just tried to murder me for those same savings. "I need to read this more carefully," I said, gathering the papers. "Can I take these home and review them with my own lawyer?" Mr. Brennan and Sandra exchanged a quick glance. "Of course," Sandra said. "But Margaret, I hope you won't take too long. I'm so worried about your safety. What if whoever tried to poison you tries again? Actually, I said, standing up, I've been thinking about that. If someone is targeting me for my money, maybe I should be more public about transferring it. Let people know that I'm no longer a wealthy target. Public how? David asked, speaking for the first time since I'd arrived. I thought I might give an interview to the local newspaper, talk about the poisoning attempt and how it's made me reconsider my finances. Let everyone know that I'm transferring everything to you for safety. The color drained from Sandra's face. I don't think that's wise. You don't want to attract more attention from criminals. But if they know I don't have money anymore, why would they bother with me? Because, Sandra struggled for words, because they might not believe it. They might think you're lying. I smiled innocently. Well, if the transfer is documented publicly, they'd have to believe it. In fact, maybe Detective Collins should know about it too, for his investigation. No, Sandra said quickly. I mean, we shouldn't bother the police with financial matters when they're trying to catch a poisoner. But I was already pulling out my phone. I think I'll call him now. He said to contact him if anything seemed suspicious. And this whole situation is certainly suspicious. Margaret, wait. Sandra struggled to sit up straighter. Maybe we should think about this more carefully. Think about what? You said yourself that transferring my assets would protect me. So let's make sure everyone knows about it. I was already dialing Detective Collins' number when Sandra made her first real mistake. Don't call the police, she said, her voice sharp with panic. Just don't. The mask had slipped completely. David was staring at his wife with growing confusion, finally seeing a glimpse of who she really was. Why not? I asked, holding the phone to my ear as it rang. Sandra opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing she'd trapped herself. Any explanation for why she didn't want the police involved would only raise more suspicions. Detective Collins, this is Margaret Wilson. I think I need to speak with you again about the poisoning case. Detective Collins arrived within 30 minutes, his presence filling the living room with an air of official authority. Sandra had retreated back to her invalid pose on the couch, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled as she smoothed her hair. Mrs. Wilson, the detective said, settling into the chair across from me. You said you had something important to discuss about the case. Yes. My family has been pressuring me to transfer my assets to my son for safety reasons, and I wanted to make sure this was documented with your investigation. Detective Collins pulled out his notebook. What kind of pressure? David shifted uncomfortably. It's not pressure, Detective. We're just concerned about Mom's safety. If someone is targeting her for money, removing that motive seems logical. I see. And when did you first discuss this asset transfer? Well, David glanced at Sandra. We'd talked about it before the poisoning incident. How long before? About 3 weeks, I said quietly. David asked me to sign over my house and savings. When I refused, he asked me to move out. The detective's pen stopped moving. You were asked to leave your home 3 weeks ago, and then someone tried to poison you? Yes? And now you're being asked to sign over your assets for protection? Sandra finally spoke up, her voice carefully controlled. Detective, I was the one who was poisoned. I'm the victim here. If Margaret hadn't switched our plates by accident, she would be dead, and I would be fine. About that, Detective Collins said, consulting his notes. I've been reviewing the case files. Mrs. Morrison, you purchased 3 containers of rat poison the day after Mrs. Wilson refused to sign the asset transfer. Can you explain why you needed so much? Sandra's face went pale. We had a serious rodent problem, yet your neighbors report no issues with rodents. In fact, Mrs. Chen next door said she's lived here for 15 years and never seen a single mouse. Maybe they were just in our garage, Sandra said weakly. We searched your garage, Mrs. Morrison. No signs of rodent droppings, no damage, no evidence of any pest problem. Detective Collins turned to a fresh page in his notebook. The store clerk also remembers you asking specific questions about how much poison would be needed and how quickly it would work. David was staring at his wife with growing horror. Sandra, what is he talking about? I was just being thorough, Sandra said, but her voice was cracking. I wanted to make sure I bought enough. Enough for what? Detective Collins asked. According to the medical examiner, the amount of poison in your system was just under the lethal dose for an adult woman. The amount found in the cake would have easily killed someone Mrs. Wilson's size. The room went dead silent. David looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. I don't understand, he whispered. Your wife put enough poison in that cake to kill your mother. Detective Collins said bluntly. The only reason Mrs. Morrison is alive is because Mrs. Wilson accidentally switched their plates. No. David shook his head. Sandra would never. She saved Mom's life. She tried to take it, I said gently. The whole story about someone else trying to poison me was a lie. Sandra brought that cake to Helen's house specifically to kill me. But why? David's voice broke. Why would you want to hurt my mother? Sandra was crying now. Real tears this time, but they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. Your mother has so much money, and we have so many expenses. The house needs work. We want to start a family, and she's just sitting on all that cash doing nothing with it. So you tried to murder her? David's voice rose to a shout. It wasn't supposed to be murder. It was supposed to be natural. An old woman having a heart attack after a family dispute. No one would have questioned it too closely. The confession hung in the air like poison gas. Detective Collins was writing rapidly, and I could see him preparing to make an arrest. There's more, I said quietly. Sandra had a lawyer here yesterday, pressuring me to sign asset transfer papers. Even after trying to kill me, she was still working on getting my money. Mr. Brennan, who had been quietly observing from the dining room, suddenly stood up. I think I should leave. Actually, Mr. Brennan, you should stay, Detective Collins said. I'll need to speak with you about your role in this scheme. I had no knowledge of any poisoning attempt, the lawyer said quickly. Mrs. Morrison simply asked me to draft asset protection documents. Asset protection for whom? The detective asked. Because it seems like the only person Mrs. Wilson needed protection from was your client. David was sitting with his head in his hands, his whole world collapsing around him. Sandra, how could you do this? How could you try to kill my mother? Because she was standing in the way of our future, Sandra snapped, her facade finally crumbling completely. She's an old woman living alone in a huge house, hoarding money she'll never spend. We could have used that money to build something beautiful, to have the life we deserve. She deserves to live. Does she? She's lonely, David. She has no friends except that bitter sister. She spends her days gardening and reading romance novels. What kind of life is that? I felt a chill run through me at the casual cruelty in her voice. To Sandra, I wasn't a person with inherent worth. I was just an obstacle to her financial goals. Margaret, Sandra turned to me with desperate eyes. You could still sign the papers. We could say this was all a misunderstanding. I made a mistake with the rat poison, but I never meant to hurt you. You bought 3 containers of poison the day after I refused to give you my money, I said calmly. You researched how much would be needed to kill someone. You brought me a cake laced with enough poison to stop my heart. The only mistake you made was eating it yourself. Detective Collins stood up. Sandra Morrison, you're under arrest for attempted murder. As the handcuffs clicked around Sandra's wrists, she looked at David with pleading eyes. You can't let them do this to me. I'm your wife. We're supposed to be a team. David wouldn't look at her. You tried to kill my mother. For us, for our future. There is no us anymore, David said quietly. There never really was there? You just saw me as a way to get to Mom's money. As the police led Sandra away, still protesting her innocence and begging David to help her, I felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for the son who was discovering that the woman he'd loved was a stranger willing to commit murder for money. David sat alone in the living room that had once been mine, surrounded by legal documents that would now never be signed. Mom, he said without looking up, I'm so sorry. I almost helped her kill you. I moved to sit beside him on the couch. You didn't know who she really was. I should have known. I should have seen it. He finally looked at me, his eyes red with unshed tears. Can you ever forgive me? I took his hand in mine, feeling how young and lost he seemed despite being 38 years old. There's nothing to forgive. You fell in love with the person she pretended to be. What do I do now? Now you come home, I said simply, if you want to. For the first time in 5 years, my son smiled at me with genuine warmth. I'd like that very much. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making German chocolate cake from scratch. The real recipe this time, the one my mother had taught me 50 years ago. David was coming home from his final divorce hearing, and I wanted to mark the occasion with something sweet. The house felt like mine again. David had moved back in temporarily while he sorted out his life, but he'd been careful to restore everything to the way it was before Sandra's influence had changed it. My reading chair was back in its place by the window. My family photos were returned to the mantel. Even my husband's fishing gear was back on display in the den. "Something smells incredible," David said, hanging his keys by the door. He looked younger somehow. The stress lines around his eyes softened by months of genuine peace. "How did it go?" I asked, not stopping my stirring. "It's final. The marriage is dissolved." He sat heavily at the kitchen table. "Sandra's lawyer tried one last time to get her some kind of settlement, but given the circumstances—" "How is she?" David shrugged. "The same. Still convinced she was justified in what she did. Still angry that I wouldn't stand by her." He paused. "She asked me to tell you she was sorry. Is she? Sorry she got caught, maybe. Sorry she failed. But not sorry she tried." He watched me measure vanilla extract with the same precision I'd used for decades. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course. How did you know?" "Before the cake. Before any of this came out. How did you know she was dangerous?" I considered the question while I folded nuts into the batter. "I didn't know she was dangerous exactly, but I knew she didn't love you." "What do you mean?" "People who love you want to make you happy. Sandra spent 5 years making you smaller. She cut you off from your friends, your hobbies, your family. She made you feel guilty for caring about me, for wanting to spend time with me." I poured the batter into prepared pans. "Love doesn't diminish people, David. It builds them up." I thought she was helping me succeed. She said I needed to focus on the future, not get dragged down by the past. "And what was the past she wanted you to forget?" David was quiet for a long moment. "You. Our relationship. Everything that made me who I was before I met her." The timer rang, and I slid the cake pans into the oven. "Sandra saw you as a project, not a person. She wanted to remake you into someone more useful to her goals. I was so stupid. You were trusting." "There's a difference." I sat down across from him. "Besides, you figured it out eventually, only after she tried to murder you. But you did figure it out. When it mattered most, you chose the right side." We sat in comfortable silence, the kitchen filling with the warm smell of baking cake. Outside, I could see the roses Richard had planted blooming in the late spring sunshine. Everything felt right again, balanced in a way it hadn't been for years. "Detective Collins called this morning," David said eventually. "Sandra pled guilty to attempted murder. She'll serve 8 to 12 years. How do you feel about that?" "Relieved? Mostly. I was dreading a trial, having to testify about our marriage, about how she manipulated me." He ran his hands through his hair. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, the way she talked about elderly people, how dismissive she was of anyone she considered weak or useless. She talked about elderly people all the time. She'd see old people at the grocery store moving slowly and make comments about how they should just stay home, stop taking up space. She said nursing homes were warehouses for people who'd outlived their purpose." David's voice grew quiet. "I thought she was just impatient. I didn't realize she genuinely believed some people were disposable." The cruelty of it still took my breath away. To Sandra, my age had made me expendable, my money the only thing that gave my life value. What about Mr. Brennan, the lawyer? Suspended from practice pending investigation. Turns out Sandra wasn't his only client involved in questionable asset transfers. The state bar is looking into several cases where elderly people signed over their assets and then died unexpectedly soon after. You think Sandra had done this before? The police are investigating. They found correspondence between Sandra and several other women around her age, all married to men with wealthy parents. It might have been some kind of informal network, sharing strategies for getting inheritance money early. I shivered at the thought. How many families had been destroyed by women like Sandra? How many elderly parents had died alone and confused, betrayed by the people they'd trusted most? The oven timer rang again, and I pulled out 2 perfect cake layers, golden brown and fragrant. As I set them on cooling racks, David reached over and hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it. For choosing her over you, for throwing you out of your own home, for almost letting her kill you." You didn't almost let her kill me, I said firmly. You saved my life. How? By being the kind of man who could recognize the truth when he finally saw it. By having enough love left in your heart to choose right over easy? I patted his cheek gently. Your father would be proud of you. Would he? Even after everything I did wrong? Especially after everything you did wrong. It's easy to make good choices when you're not being manipulated. It takes real character to find your way back to right when someone has spent years leading you astray. That evening, we sat on the front porch eating cake and watching the sunset. The same porch where Sandra had first outlined her plans to control my assets. The same house she'd tried to steal by murdering me. But now, it was ours again, filled with the kind of peace that only comes from surviving something terrible together. What will you do now? I asked David. I don't know yet. Start over, I guess. Figure out who I am when I'm not being someone else's project. He took another bite of cake. Maybe I'll take some time off work, help you with the garden. Dad always said he was going to teach me to grow roses. I'd like that. And, Mom? I want you to know that I understand now why you wouldn't sign those papers. It wasn't just about the money, was it? No, it was about dignity. About having the right to make my own choices, even if they're not the choices other people would make for me. Sandra never understood that. Sandra never understood that people have value beyond their usefulness to her. A police car drove slowly past the house, and I thought about Sandra sitting in her cell, probably still convinced that she'd been the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own downfall. Some people never learn that love can't be bought, stolen, or forced. They spend their whole lives trying to acquire it through manipulation and control, never realizing that real love freely given is the only kind worth having. Thank you, David said suddenly. For what? For not giving up on me? For fighting back? For being stronger than she was? I squeezed his hand. That's what mothers do. We protect our children, even when they don't know they need protecting, even when they don't deserve it, especially then. As darkness settled over our quiet neighborhood, I felt a deep satisfaction settle into my bones. Sandra had tried to erase me from my own life, to reduce me to nothing more than an obstacle to her greed. But I was still here, still in my own home, still making cake and watching sunsets and loving my son despite his mistakes. I had won not through revenge or cruelty, but simply by refusing to disappear. Sometimes the greatest victory is just surviving with your dignity intact. The cake was perfect, rich and sweet, with just a hint of coconut. Nothing bitter, nothing hidden, nothing designed to harm, just the simple pleasure of something made with love and shared with someone who matters. That, I realized, was the difference between Sandra and me. She had tried to take everything through violence and deception. I had kept everything through patience and love, and in the end, love had won.